With week 2 in the books, let's take a look at 6 players that I'm looking to trade for in my fantasy league. Starting first with Washington Commanders running back Bijan Robinson, who some might say is the better B. Robinson running back in fantasy football right now, which is actually factually correct through 2 weeks. But I don't know if people actually realize what Bijan Robinson has been doing to start the year. 89 total yards and a touchdown in week 1 for 18 fantasy points. And then while he didn't find the end zone this past weekend, rushed for over 130 yards on 17 carries for another 14.5 PPR fantasy points. He's the current RB14 through 2 weeks, ahead of Bijan Robinson, Derrick Henry, Travis Etienne, and Jonathan Taylor. And he is the clear RB1 on the Washington Commanders, out-snapping and out-touching Austin Eckler both weeks by a pretty decent margin, basically doubling the number of touches that Eckler had received so far to start the year. And this is the upside that I had hoped for Bijan Robinson being the RB1 for Washington, because Cliff Kingsbury has been extremely friendly for fantasy running backs dating back to his time in Arizona. In 2019, it was a 2-half season for the Cardinals running backs, with David Johnson averaging 17 touches per game to start the year, pacing for 1,600 total yards and 14 touchdowns as a top 8 fantasy running back. And then they traded for Kenyon Drake mid-season, and over the second half, Drake then paced for 1,600 yards and 17 touchdowns as a top 5 fantasy running back. In 2020, Kenyon Drake was the full-time guy all year and put up over 1,100 yards and 10 touchdowns on 265 touches, finishing as the RB16 in total points. Then in 2021, we get James Conner now, totaling 1,100 yards and finished as the RB5 overall in fantasy on the back of 18 total touchdowns. And then again in 2022, another 1,100 yard season with 8 touchdowns for James Conner as a top 20 fantasy back in total points and RB10 in points per game. And remember, all of that was with a very mobile Kyler Murray, who was also vulturing rushing touchdowns, so Jaden Daniels is not a major concern for Bijan Robinson to stop getting touchdown opportunities. So between the history of running back production in the Cliff Kingsbury offense, top 15 fantasy production already to start the year, then you look at his upcoming schedule of the Bengals this week, who were just torched by Ramondre Stevenson and Isaiah Pacheco, the Cardinals next week in a Cliff Kingsbury revenge game, the Browns are a tough matchup, the Ravens are a tough matchup, but then they get Carolina, Chicago, and the New York Giants again. Again, I don't know if people have been catching on to just how good Bijan Robinson has been to start the year, so take advantage now and see if you can add something to more temporary players like Jerome Ford, Zach Charbonnet, or weaker NFL starters like a Zach Moss, Devin Singletary, or DeAndre Swift, and go get Bijan Robinson. Now, I will add, I jokingly said that Bijan Robinson is the better B. Robinson for fantasy, and that is true because Bijan Robinson has not been overly fantastic for fantasy to start the year, with back-to-back games of 16 fantasy points as the RB15 on the year. Now, for most running backs, that's pretty good production, but for a player drafted as a top 3 guy with your first overall pick, not so much. But the crazy part about Bijan's production so far is that he's averaging that 16 fantasy points per game without scoring a touchdown, which is insane. He's the only running back in the top 20 in scoring who hasn't scored a touchdown yet, and he's RB15. He's seen 18 plus touches in both games, including 4 plus receptions in both games. He's totaled over 110 yards in both weeks and is averaging over 5 yards per carry. He just hasn't found the end zone yet. In fact, if he had scored once over the past 2 weeks, he'd go from RB15 to RB9 in fantasy scoring, and had he scored twice, he'd jump up to RB4, right behind Devon Achane and Saquon Barkley, which does sound a lot more like the player that people thought they were getting when they drafted him. And I'm not suggesting that people would all of a sudden sell low on Bijan Robinson after just a bad couple of weeks, but I do think that people would be open to a trade if they got what they perceive to be an equally productive running back and something kind of fun on top. So if you can add something to a Ramondre Stevenson, a James Cook, a Derrick Henry, Jonathan Taylor, maybe even take advantage of the J.K. Dobbins hype or Jordan Mason hype right now and go get Bijan Robinson, that is worth exploring just to see if you can pull away Bijan now before he has a massive 30-point week. And I do have one quick reiteration from last week that I am still looking to buy Josh Jacobs. I mentioned that Bijan Robinson is the only running back in the top 20 without a touchdown right now. Well, Bijan and Josh Jacobs are the only running backs in the top 27 without touchdowns, and Josh Jacobs is currently the RB21. He has seen a ton of volume. The offense is going to continue to flow through him without Jordan Love, and when Jordan Love Love gets back, he's going to have a higher chance of scoring because the offense is just better. Jacobs is very acquirable right now because he's only scored 12 and 13 points each week, but the clock is ticking, so make your move now before he actually finds the end zone and has that big 20-plus point week. Now, before we move on, I wanted to let y'all know to head over to 4for4.com and sign up for a subscription today to gain access to the industry's best weekly rankings from award-winning ranker for accuracy John Paulson. Plus, you get access to our start-sit tool, trade calculator, articles, and there are additional packages for DFS and betting content too. Make sure to use the code YouTube at checkout to receive 25% off your annual subscription today. All right, moving on to the wide receiver position, the biggest buy in maybe all of fantasy football right now is, of course, Amari Cooper, because he has seen a tremendous amount of volume and has so far done absolutely nothing with it. And normally, I would consider that perhaps more of a bad thing than a good thing, but we know who Amari Cooper is. We know what he's capable of. He's just being killed by Deshaun Watson's complete inability to do anything resembling an NFL caliber quarterback right now. Out of 16 wide receivers with 17 or more targets so far, Amari is the only one not currently in the top 36 in scoring at the position, and he is actually all the way down at wide receiver 81. 81. He is 16th in total opportunity in terms of targets, but he is 81st in fantasy points. That alone cannot sustain itself, and much better weeks are ahead for Amari with that kind of volume. In fact, to Watson's credit, Amari hasn't completely helped himself either, as he has two horrific drops in both weeks. One was this past weekend that was an easy 20-plus yard game. Maybe it was a touchdown if you put on the right moves. And the other from week 1 was definitely a 35-yard touchdown had he hauled it in. Sure, maybe these passes could have been a little bit more accurate, but I mean, come on, Amari Cooper, you got to bring these in. So just right there, from those two plays, if we just conservatively give him 55 more yards and 1 touchdown on the year, drastically changes the perception around Amari Cooper right now and moves him from wide receiver 81 up to wide receiver 53, which still is not great, but that's just 2 plays. We're not even talking about the other handful of inaccurate passes from Deshaun Watson that Amari Cooper could have had, thus increasing his fantasy point total to a more respectable fantasy wide receiver 3 or even back-end fantasy wide receiver 2. So this isn't an Amari Cooper problem. He's getting open. He looks great himself as a receiver minus those 2 drops. It's just a quarterback issue. So imagine if Deshaun Watson actually does get benched for Jameis Winston, who we know isn't afraid to chuck it all over the field and will hyper-target his best receiver, which on the Browns is very easily Amari Cooper. That upside is very realistic and as little as maybe just a couple of weeks away. But even without a swap to Jameis Winston, Amari will still have better days ahead with Deshaun Watson. It's just impossible not to with the kind of volume that he's getting. So what I would do is I would dangle out some waiver wire player or some other bench guy that you have that could be performing well right now and flip them for Amari Cooper. I'm talking guys like Alec Pierce, Quentin Johnston, Darnell Mooney, Khalil Shakir, maybe Demarcus Robinson right now with Puka and Cooper Kupp out. See if the Amari manager is panicking hard and buy an extremely talented player for cheap for the rest of the year. Even if you yourself don't start Amari immediately after trading for him, you're still going to come out ahead over the course of the entire season. Now, in a very similar argument to Amari Cooper is another wide receiver not scoring points right now, and I mean quite literally not scoring points at all because he hasn't played, and that is T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. And I'm sure whoever drafted Higgins in your league is probably close to fed up with him and maybe even mad at themselves for buying into Higgins after all of his injury problems last year. And that is precisely the emotion that I want to take advantage of to buy T. Higgins now for super cheap. And listen, there's no new argument here for T. Higgins that you haven't already heard. We know that when healthy, T. Higgins is really, really good. He's just struggled to stay healthy recently. But recent reports from Zach Taylor suggest that T. Higgins could be back this week, which is huge because they play the Washington Commanders, who I think honestly has a worse defense than my local high school team does. And then after that, they get the Carolina Panthers, the Ravens, who have gotten absolutely shredded in both weeks by receivers, then the New York Giants, then the Cleveland Browns, and then the Philadelphia Eagles. That is the next 5 weeks of games for Cincinnati. And if they get a healthy T. Higgins back, boy, there is some juicy, serious potential for some big games here. Again, I don't think it would take all that much to buy T. Higgins right now. I would look at flipping the exact same group of receivers that I mentioned for Amari Cooper, and you might not even honestly need to go that high. It might just take someone like a Ladd McConkey, a Brandon Cooks, Jalen Naylor maybe with Justin Jefferson possibly out, or Allen Lazard still from his big week 1 performance. I think it's worth a shot to buy and stash T. Higgins before he comes back from injury because we know how good he can be when he's healthy with Joe Burrow. And just like I did for the running backs, I have another reiteration from my video last week at the wide receiver position in Brandon Ayuk, who once again did not have an overly great week 2 performance with 4 catches, 43 yards, less than 8.5 PPR fantasy points, but he did play nearly 20 more snaps than he did in week 1, and he doubled his production from week 1 as well. Oh, and he was missed again on another end zone target that took Brock Purdy about 2 seconds too long to throw the pass to a wide open Brandon Ayuk. So that is 2 weeks in a row now where Ayuk barely missed the touchdown, and had he come down with both of them, he'd be a top 25 fantasy wide receiver next to Amon-Ra St. Brown and Brian Thomas, not the current wide receiver 59 next to Jalen McMillan and Michael Wilson. So just like Josh Jacobs, if you weren't able to buy Ayuk last week, you have been given another few days to make that move before he has a big monster 100+ yard game or actually hauls in a touchdown, which honestly could be as soon as this week against the LA Rams based on what Marvin Harrison Jr. just did to them on Sunday, or maybe the following week against New England, who just got decimated by DK Metcalf and Jackson Smith and Jigba. So please, go buy Brandon Ayuk right now.